trying to understand how and why these forests got degraded and what we could do in order to prevent it. But one problem I had when I was doing this was that when I was trying to understand degradation was I had a lot of trouble trying to find a natural forest to use as comparison. Now, again, this seems like it should be pretty easy, right? What do natural forests look like in this landscape? A lot of people advise me that I should use the nearby protected area for comparison because, they were less disturbed, or that I should use in the landscape if I see some patches of forest far from human habitation and that look like better forests, that they might be the better forests. So I'm sure many of us are very familiar with these sal sands that I have an image of here because they look like really good forests. But I wanted to make sure this was real. And so I spent a lot of time trying to understand like how these forests were actually constructed. And so what I found was that a lot of that basically when the British era forest department started, they recreated a lot of the forest landscape. So the forest department was started by this German forester. And at the time, they used to manage forests for timber value. So for timber value, you want a very straight bole and you want a very tall tree. And so they did a lot of modification of the forest to make sure that the timber value was enhanced. So for this, they planted a lot of trees. So you have plantations of teak, you have plantations of pine, etc. across the landscape. For some species like with sal, sal used to grow with other species like boswellia and it used to grow crooked. And so what the forest department then did was they removed the boswellia and the other species in the forest so that the sal would grow straight. In a lot of cases, you'll see like a lot of, like once I presented to people, when I present to people who live near forested landscape, they also say there's a lot of forest in the landscape, but all the sal trees are in rows, or all the even mixed trees are in rows. So those also seem to be a legacy of plantations. In many cases, like there's actual forest department records from the 1880s saying we planted 1,000 acres of teak here, or we planted 1,000 acres of teak there. And those are now very often like the core area of a protected area. So actually, those forests are also plantations. And in none of these cases have they given a GPS location for where they did all these modifications. So which makes it really difficult for us to understand what is the natural forest then. Yeah? Is this clear so far? Okay. And so then I try to look at maybe I could get records from before the British era when they really transformed the forest to try and understand what the forest was at that time. And so one thing that you find from the historical records is that there's a shifting forest frontier. So when the taxes were high and people were disincentivized to practice agriculture, the forest would expand. And when the taxes were low and people were incentivized to practice agriculture, the forest would contract. So the forest frontier was always shifting. And then you have records of Maratha officials like removing bad species that they thought had grown, etc., etc. So the way they value trees and forests is also very different. And in addition, there are a lot of archaeological research, and archaeological research has identified central India as an area of a shifting cultivation domain. So that is where local communities, they would burn down a patch of forest, grow agriculture there, and then move away and come back. Depending on the tradition, they may come back every 9 years in the case of the Begas, or they may come back every 7 years, etc., etc. But again, it's unclear how widespread or intense this burning was, where it was located, etc., etc. And, and no, historically, nobody was really doing a biodiversity survey that we can compare directly with modern data, right? And so then I decided to go into looking at paleoecological records. So imagine this is the landscape, and this blue item here is a lake. So 15,000 years ago, there would be some trees, and the trees would have given out some pollen, and that pollen would come and deposit itself in the sediments of the lake at that time. Similarly, if there were fire would give out micro charcoal pieces that would then deposit itself in the sediment layer of the time. And so forth. So for example, if you had herbivores or livestock, their dung would end up here in the sediment core at that time, right? And so the lake gets filled with the strata of that time. 10,000 years ago, it's different tree species, it's different fire regimes, it's different herbivory, it gets deposited. 5,000 years ago, again, the same process happens. And today we can go and we can collect the score from the bottom of the lake, And we get a sediment core where all this history has got recorded. And then we can analyze it. So what I did was, and what all can you do with such a core? So one thing you can get from this is you can get the pollen composition at that time in the core. And this pollen composition will give us like the plant assemblages. Now, depending on the species, we may be able to reconstruct the forest composition, the forest type, the agriculture, etc., etc. You can also quantify micro charcoal, which gives you an idea of fire frequency. There are a lot of chemicals that may get deposited also, which are called biomarkers. So, for example, livestock will have a particular kind of chemical in their dung. And so, if you find that chemical, you can quantify the amount of herbivory in the system. Similarly, if the fire was more intense, the burning may be more complete. So, that chemical signature also gets recorded in the sediment core. You can also quantify isotopic ratios, which gives you like things like you can reconstruct climate with it. You can recreate whether it's a C3 photosynthetic species or a C4 photosynthetic species. Finally, you can also extract ancient DNA from these cores and use that to reconstruct everything from like herpetofaunal diversity to mammalian diversity, etc., etc. So what we did was, in central India, we went and took some cores. And so here you can see the lake has dried up. So it's really easy for us to core. And then the core comes out and you can see we're really happy we've extracted this smooth cylindrical core. Then what we do is we just record some stratigraphy, which is like the geological conditions, the deposit type, etc., etc. Then what we do is from the core, we extract all the fossils for carbon dating. So here we've extracted the fossils from different depths that we're going to use for carbon dating. And once we have the carbon dates, we can reconstruct a sediment profile. So for example, this is a sediment profile we've recreated for one of our sites. And what we do here is you can see we've taken two fossils from two different locations. We get basically their ages, and based on that we can say, okay, for any point, for any depth of that sediment core, what would the age of that depth be? And so here you can see that and then you divide up the entire sediment meters intervals or 2 centimeter subsamples, and for each subsample then you can quantify, you know, the age of the subsample, and you can quantify things like what's the micro charcoal count, what's the species composition, etc., etc. Once you've cleaned up the sediment, prepared the samples, we can do microscopy, and using microscopy, we can identify the pollen. So these are some common pollen that we find. On the top row, we have some trees, and at the bottom row, we have some herbs. So for some common trees here, this is the first species is the pollen of terminalia that we found, which is like saja. The second one is Diospyros or tendu, and so you can see individual species across time. Okay. So what we did was we also used samples collected by Dr. Kamar and Dr. Chauhan from Birbal Sahni Institute of Palaeosciences. And they had, as you can see, 15 cores across central India. And the maps here show you the image on the left is across the temperature profile. So you can see the sites are at different temperatures. And the right image is for precipitation. So you can see the sites here are different precipitations. And so we collated all this data to try and understand the history of central India with respect to tree cover. So what we find and what does it mean? So one really simple rule to analyze this is that grass does not grow in the shade. So if you have a closed canopy tree, like for example, in this system, you have a closed canopy sal stand, there's no grass growing under it. So one metric we used for analysis was basically the proportion of arboreal species or the proportion of tree cover. And so you can see it's tree divided by tree plus grass, which basically tells you if the numbers are high, that means tree cover is high and grass cover is low. If the number is low, it means tree cover is low and grass cover is high. So let's look at just some basic patterns. So one thing to see here, the numbers here is how many years ago it is. So the top row is 15,000 years ago, 14,000 years ago, 13,000 years ago, etc. And it's going all the way till 1,000 years ago. So, and if now what happens is when you do the cores, sometimes the core may be from 5,000 years ago to 8,000 years ago. So that core will only have values for those years and it'll be absent in other years. So in this image, if in some years you see only one core, that means only that core was present at that time. So just looking at this image, again, you can see black means that the proportion of arboreal trees was more than 60%. 0.4 means it's 40 to 60%, etc., etc. So if we just look at this image, what are some obvious patterns that are coming out at us? Does anybody want to answer? Anyone? Okay, no. So basically, one thing that you can see really clearly is that the tree cover was pretty low from the beginning. So it's not like there's high tree cover that's decreasing across time. The tree cover is pretty low from the beginning. The second thing we notice is that the tree cover keeps fluctuating. So sometimes it's high, and then it's like, say, if we look at the image on the top left, sometimes it's between 5 to 40%, and then it becomes less than 5%. So they're also moving, changing through time. And so you can see that, but and then you can go from low tree cover to high tree cover to back to low tree cover and back to high tree cover. And so you can see the system A has a lot of low tree cover and also it keeps changing its system. So can we try and understand why would this be, right? You expect that the tree cover should be, I mean, one imagines that the tree cover in central India should be higher. So one way to understand what the tree cover should be is to look at what is the biome one expects given the temperature and precipitation conditions. So given the temperature and precipitation conditions, so this is just how the different biomes map out depending on the temperature and precipitation conditions. So depending on that, what we expect here is a tropical forest. And here, if you see a map of where they've plotted out what the expected forest type is, given the temperature and precipitation conditions, you can see that central India is following very much in the moist and dry broadleaf forest, deciduous forest. However, Shankaran in 2005 showed that even if you have the precipitation conditions for a forest, you may have areas with high tree cover and areas with low tree cover. And then Staver, etc., and Hirota, etc., found that you can have many disturbances in a system. So a disturbance may be in the form of fire, or it may be in the form of herbivory, or it may be in the form of human activity. And what they found, and this is across continents in the tropical areas, when there was no, in this case, the disturbance is fire. But when there was no fire, the tree cover was high. And when there was fire, the tree cover was low. So the question becomes, is the low tree cover in central India due to disturbance? And does, like we've seen the tree cover increase and decrease, is the tree cover changing because of a change in the disturbance regime? So I hope this is clear up till now. So the second concept, first we talked about how, tree cover and grass cover. The second concept I want to discuss is anthromes. So anthromes is basically, it's a lot of paleoecologists have used this concept to, and this is a great paper, by the way, to try and understand how so if human activity is really influencing a biome, we can call it anthromes. So how they imagine the system is that across time, you're going to have settlements, and the community living in the settlement may be hunter-gatherer, it may be horticultural, it may be agrarian, it may be industrial. So if you're a hunter-gatherer in a settlement, then most of the landscape should be forest with a little bit of open area. If you have horticultural, which means you have now kitchen gardens, so you're maybe growing some vegetables for yourself, you're going to have mostly tree, but you'll have a lot more open forest. Once you become agrarian, you're going to have a lot of cultivated land. And finally, when you're industrial, then you have industrial on the landscape as well. So what they did was they classified the anthromes into three types. If the intensive land use by human activity was more than 20%, they called it an intense anthrome. If there was no apparent human activity, they called it a wild land. And if it was something in between, they called it a cultured anthrome. And what they found is that the areas today that have the highest biodiversity are those that map onto cultured anthromes in the past. So let's see how this plays out in our landscape. So first, before going to the anthrome, I just thought I'd show you something about settlements and cultivation. What we have in this map, it's similar to the previous map, is that if it's red, that means there is evidence of settlement in that land, in that site. So in this case, we've classified settlement in any kind of kitchen garden species like Brassicaceae, Amaranthus, Cannabis, etc. They all represent some sort of settlement. Cereal, once cereal comes into the landscape, it could be cultivated. So basically, they're practicing agriculture. So again, I'm going to ask, are there any patterns one is seeing to do with settlement and agriculture in this landscape across time? Okay. So one thing we can see is that the settlement for whenever there are cores, their settlement seems to be there from the beginning, from 15,000 years ago. And in cereal seems to follow soon after. And again, like in our previous thing, sometimes settlement switches to cereal, sometimes cereal goes away and it's still settlement. So again, there's a fluctuation between settlements and cereals, but they've been there on the landscape for almost the entire period that we examined. If we look at anthromes, here again, going back, so green means it's a land, so it's less than 5% in. More than 20% means it's intense. And in between are various levels of cultured anthromes. So is there any pattern here we can see with respect to anthromes? No. Okay, so I'll tell you. So basically, one thing you can see is that that cultured anthromes have been there since the beginning. The second thing you can see is you're seeing a fluctuation, right? Cultured anthromes may become wildlands that may become cultured anthromes again. And there's again fluctuation between the patterns. And so And so when we come back to this original image of proportional tree cover in the system, could it be that these disturbances are responsible for this lower tree cover? And so to try and understand why the tree cover was so low, we ran a model where we try to predict tree cover based on for each site, based on the anthrome, the fire, the herbivory, the precipitation, and the temperature. And what we found was that as precipitation increases, tree cover increases. And across the Holocene, the Indian summer monsoon has been strengthening. And so the monsoon has been increasing. And so tree cover has increased because of that. But in addition, where there's fire, the tree cover reduces. And so here we've shown pretty clearly that in our case, the fire disturbance seems to be a major predictor of tree cover in the landscape in the last 15,000 years. The other interesting thing we found was similar to that paper I showed you earlier, where there were these two peaks. Remember, one peak said when there's no disturbance, tree cover is high, and when there is disturbance, tree cover is low. We found a similar bimodal structure. Now, people have argued that this bimodal structure where you can have and savanna because of disturbance is a forest savanna mosaic. And can we think of what use, like, is it good to have what is the purpose of a forest savanna mosaic? Okay, so basically, one advantage that forest savanna mosaic has, it has a lot more grasses, right? And most mega herbivores, they do depend on grass a lot for their nutrition. Humans are also more mega herbivores, and the major component of our diet is a grass, cereal, right? So when you have more grasses, you can support more mega herbivore biomass, which then supports more carnivores. And across the world, they've shown that these forest savanna mosaics are some of the most biodiverse, especially when it comes to mega herbivores. And many scientists for the last decade have been saying that actually the forests of India, our Western Ghats, Northeastern Himalayas, are actually this forest savanna mosaic and not really the pure forest. But in a forest savanna mosaic, you do have both forest and savanna. So just to look at some of the more forested aspect of it, we know the landscape is really like, we know there's a transition between Sal and Teak in this landscape. So here we can look at Sal and Teak across the landscape. So here, I forget, I can't, okay, my legend is on the right, great. So here you can see if it's green, it's Sal. If it's brown, it's Teak. If it's purple, it's both. And if it's white, then none of them were present in that site at that time. And so again, can we see some major patterns here? Okay, no. So you can see that even though just south of this in Maharashtra, teak was there from 9,000 years ago, teak is only coming to this landscape around 3,000 years ago and is very much clustered on the western side. Sal, although it was present a long time ago, 12,000 and 11,000 years ago, it disappeared and it came back. So again, here too, you can see of Sal presence and teak presence. Sometimes they're present, sometimes they're absent, they come back. So it's a system that again has a lot of dynamics. So overall, this is just a typical paleo map. We can see that the environmental changes, environmental conditions are changing across time. So if you look at the blue figure, you can see that the precipitation is decreasing with time. Sorry, increasing with time. So below is 13,000 years ago, and as we move up, it's more current. So you can see precipitation increasing across time, and there's some variation there. Then if we look at some disturbance regimes, so here you can look at settlements, cereals, droughts, fire-resistant plant species, grazing-tolerant plant species. You can see they are fluctuating with time. And then you can see that tree cover and grass are changing with time. And so it seems that tree cover changes with change in environmental conditions and change in disturbance regimes, and there's a little bit of a lag. So having learned all this about the history of this landscape for the last 15,000 years, what is the best forest? Okay, so yes, the best forest is a forest that is not a closed canopy forest and does have some openness. And what do we restore to? The baseline becomes a lot more difficult because you saw the system has been changing across time, not just because precipitation has been changing, but also because disturbance regimes have been changing. And so ecological systems, we think of them as a static system. We need to conserve this forest, but actually systems are very dynamic. And rather than conserving the static system, we need to conserve the process. And in this case, the process seems to be that tree cover changes with change in precipitation and with disturbance. One thing that we did find is that when the system changes back from, so the system is going from savanna to forest, savanna to forest, savanna to forest. But once the tree species diversity drops below a certain number, then it can no longer switch back to the forest. And so if we want to conserve the ability of the system to keep switching back and forth, because the environmental conditions are always going to change, right? That's just the natural system. So if the environmental conditions are always going to change and you want to keep the resilience of the system, the ability to switch back, to continue in this process, then we should make sure that we have more niche diversity, where we make sure we have trees with high species diversity of trees that can then seed the next switch back to high tree cover, etc. The other thing I would say is that the disturbance regimes may be very different today than they were through the last 15,000 years, and we need to understand how and quantify how the disturbance regimes may have changed since then. So I want to thank all the people who have enabled this work, mainly SERB, my paleo team, my collaborators, Dr. Kamar, Dr. Charuta, etc., and all the people in Ashoka University who helped me do this work, all the previous researchers on whose work we build, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks a lot, Meghna. Hi, everyone. We are open for we have around 20 minutes for question and answers. Please feel free to just drop your question in the chat box and we can read it out for you. Thank you.
No questions?
No, I think it's coming. I think Amrita has written something in the chat box. Yeah, Amrita, please go ahead. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Meghna, thanks. That was so nice to sort of reconnect on what's happening in your lab now and the work that you're doing. I sort of had a question that sort of relates to the larger coexistence consortium. Do you think the work and sort of the patterns that you're finding, this dynamism and even the sort of, something gets domesticated or something comes back, becomes wild again, all of those things are things we grapple with that baseline question. Do you think it makes a case for the baseline is, like you said, the baseline is not as important as process, but also who's sort of doing that process, right? Like you said, disturbance regimes now are very different. And who are the actors who are doing that? Like, do you think your work can be used in that context where, say, bunch of us do studies on what's the disturbance that's currently really intense in the areas that we work in, and then we just ask, like what it was before, how dynamic it was before, was it slower? Do you think it lends to that narrative that communities were sort of managing their lands, and that's why there isn't a baseline, or climate itself was managing this fluctuation back and forth? I wondered how it subs into that narrative. Badly articulated, but I hope you know where I'm going.
So I guess the first thing here is the humans were part of the landscape, right?
Right.
So we may say that, the humans have, and, in debating with my students, etc., they say we should restore to back before the humans were there, right? I have another map here that shows the upper Paleolithic sites, right? They are also widespread across. So how far back do you go before the humans become part of the landscape? That's one question. We can restore to maybe 30,000 years ago, but that time we were in the Pleistocene when it was much colder, right? So it may not be that useful to go back to before the humans were part of the system. So that's the first thing. The humans have been part of a system, of this system, and have seem to have co-created this landscape, right, with the disturbance. Now, we don't know right now whether the fire was man-made or whether it was natural. But generally, natural causes, even today, if you quantify how many fires are caused by lightning strikes, the number, it's not been done for India yet, and we're trying to do it. But right now, the number is about maybe at 30% for South Africa. Right. So as a result, so it's possible. I mean, we are trying to investigate that how much of the fires were man-made, but again, this landscape does seem to have been created in that case. The second thing I would like to say is that, as I said, so the climate is always going to change. That's just geological. That's just the geology of Earth, right? So creating the disturbance regime.
Hey, Meghna, we sort of lost you when you were saying these changes are geological.
Oh, sorry. So saying was that climate, the changing climate is, there are a lot of geological processes. So the climate is always going to change, right? Because as you know, like the Milankovitch cycles, etc., change, etc. So the plant community that is created is a function of all these other factors. So I think the question you were wanting to ask is that who should be responsible for determining the disturbance regime?
Yeah, more than that, does the work lend itself to the narrative of this co-creation of a space, and therefore makes the baseline kind of moot, right? And so it's more
Yeah.
like, how do you manage the disturbance regime? How do you manage the diversity? How do you manage these other factors
Yeah.
within the setup? I wondered if the work directly lent to sort of community-led, co-created
So
spaces.
what we are doing is our work right now, we are trying to understand how the disturbance regime has changed. So we're creating models and we're testing parameters to see, okay, was it being burnt at every 9 years and it's become every 4 years now, or what? So for the longest time period and how it interact with climate, these various disturbance regimes. So then we should be able to know, okay, so clearly not burning at all is maybe not ideal, but maybe burning every year is not ideal either. So we need something in the middle, and then we can go back to this. It's not a static baseline, but generally what seems to have been
Right.
the historic practice.
Yeah, super interesting, and also super interesting to see what comes next with the disturbance regime stuff.
Yeah. So I'll address Ravi's question. Ravi, do you want to add anything to this? Or should I just answer this question?
Nothing to add. Go ahead.
Oh, so we call it now forest savanna mosaics or savanna woodland systems. But because this was a public talk, I thought I'd begin with forest just so that, because that's a word that we're all familiar with.
And I think that's part of the problem. Our familiarity of forest is tall, green, close canopy. And then the whole privileging of good forest, bad forest.
Right. And so that's what, so The aim of my talk was to, I hope, I guess I'm to try and really disentangle that thing. But yeah, maybe I could have, but if I had begun with
No,
some
no,
other,
no, sorry, Meghna, this is not a criticism of what your talk was, but I'm just making a general point that
sure.
all of us need to start embracing a different language if you want attitudes and approaches to change.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah.
Yes, Seema, do you want to unmute yourself or do you can just drop a text in the chat box?
Yes. Hi. I am again bad at articulating the question, Meghna, so I'm going to ask to you. So what do you make of this new reforestation projects or the afforestation that projects that are coming up, and how useful are them, and what kind of forest are we rebuilding now?
Right. So, I mean, so actually, the reforestation project is actually pretty old. So, the thing is, like, they were reforesting in the 17th century in France because they thought that all countries should have a certain percentage of land that's forest. Then in the 1920s, they were foresting for a different reason because they wanted timber resources, right, for economic activity. In the 70s, they were reforesting because they wanted a certain amount of tree cover for environment. Now we're reforesting for climate change mitigation. So the thing is, I would not discount these plantations completely because they do provide, if nothing else, like, as I said, the system is dynamic. So as the environment changes, who knows what will happen over there. But I mean, I do have a couple of projects that are trying to disentangle what is the outcome of, closing an open canopy forest. Or like, while we may think some monoculture plantations have no value, like if you look at very old monoculture, like does the age of the monoculture plantation matter? Does it matter what it was converted from? Like if it was it converted from grazing land or was it converted from, say, an open forest? So those kind of questions we are trying to look at, but yeah. But it's better to convert something into a plantation than to convert it, say, into concrete, right? Because then you've completed that system is that land, that pixel of land is then no longer the system. So the transitions can't happen. So nothing. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Kathy, please go ahead.
Are you hear me? Are you able to hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, then we can.
So again, another badly articulated question, I think. But I wanted to ask if, since you've seen transition and change over a long period of time, right, like 15,000 years, and with climate change and the Anthropocene, we talk about how there's drastic changes in a short period of time that we've seen in the last 100, 200, 500 years. So
Yeah.
I was just wondering, because you work at looking at a long period of time, is it as drastic as is the present changes much more drastic and faster in the way that it has occurred as opposed to the last 15,000 years? Or is it a matter of relativity in the way that we look at it?
So I have in my time series doesn't show up that much because in India the development was a bit later, but there are other studies that have shown that the acceleration rate is a lot more in more recent times. So like this Ellis paper that I referred to, it came out in PNAS. It really shows that there's really been an acceleration in the last 150 years. So what I'm saying is, so like all of this land, human activity I'm talking about, it's not as intense. And even you saw my map, there was only one site that was more than 20% consistently. Most of the others were moving between less than 20% to less than 5%. So the human activity, the human footprint wasn't that high. It was present. They were like, maybe they were burning it, maybe they were practicing herbivory, maybe they had passed a lot of livestock, but the intensity of land use was not that high.
Sorry, I have one more question in relation to that, which was, I was just curious if, in case you interacted with people around there now, I was wondering if they know or they go back to the kind of landscape that you were talking about in your work, that the landscape they had before? Do they have any reference to those kind of landscapes? Is the ecological knowledge related to that still existent, or is it very different now from what they
So,
think of as forest is very different now?
so I'll say, so recently I presented to some students from Green Hub, right? And Green Hub, a lot of those students had grown up living next to forests. And we had a huge debate on whether the sal stand next to them was natural or not, right? Because the thing is, people, like, yeah, because they are seeing those sal stands. Their parents saw those sal stands, those grandparents saw the sal stands. Having said that, there's quite a lot of ethnography work, especially from Baiga Chak. So what the British did was, from this landscape, they banned shifting cultivation. And then they moved all the people who still wanted to practice shifting cultivation into this area called Bega Chak, which is still there. And there they still practice it. So I think when you go to different locations, people have different stories to tell. But I would love for an ethnographer to really examine this question. I don't have the ability to do it. Yeah. Okay, I think Ankila has a question. Yeah, so she's asked a technical question. So the thing is, Ankila, there's not only just the question of the preservation of the arboreal species, there's also the deposition of the arboreal species. So what a lot of this modeling does is they model the differential deposition rate of the different pollen. Now, one limitation that my study did have, and if I was doing a full science study, I've gone into it, is that we don't have the deposition rates of the grass species right now. So that's one real limitation in this. But however, because a lot of this work that I presented is based on previous research, but now, right now in the field, we are quantifying all the stuff that we need to be able to quantify the depositional rates, to be able to really relate this issue. To do with isotopic data, again, from the previous studies have not done isotopic ratios, but we are quantifying not just isotopic ratios, but also all the other biomarkers, etc., to be able to really disentangle this question. But having said that, these sorts of ratios, like if you look at any of the other reconstructions from Europe, etc., when they have similar ratios, they also call it, it's switched to savanna, it's switched to forest. So we are using ratios similar to this have been used in Europe, where they have validated based on pollen deposition rates, but we don't have those pollen deposition rates for India right now. Thanks. Is this okay? But I'm happy to answer any more questions on this also. Yeah.
We have another question by Kanan on the chat box. Do you want me to read it out?
Does Kanan want to articulate, does he want to expand on it a bit?
Kanan, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So my background is not in zoology or anything like that. I have a banking background, but if I were to restore a plot of land, say in the Western Ghats, I understood your background on, going back in history and looking at the effect of climate, fire, people, etc. So there is no target state that we can go to. But then how do we determine if I were to get external funders to come in and say we are protecting a piece of land, then what is the target state that I can promise them in 5 years or 10 years time? Because nobody on this forum can tell me what a target state could be. So is it as simple as removing, the impact of man, that is removing the wood cutting and the grazing, removing the invasive species, restoring as far as possible the water and maybe the natural forms of the land, and then just stepping away and saying, listen, whatever forces, whatever birds, insects, however it is that they want to recolonize, we will do that. Because no specialist, no zoologist can tell me exactly what should be there in 3, 5, 10 years time.
Right. So I think here I would say that maybe there's a discipline misalignment. So I think when you're trying to do say restoration for say carbon, right? What's going to happen is you do have to show a certain carbon number, right? Similarly, if you're doing it for corporates, you may have to show a certain amount of tree cover, and tree cover is often correlated with carbon number. But for instance, some things we know is only going to improve the system, right? Removal of invasive species. I would say with regards to grazing and wood cutting, like, so my fire was the most significant predictor, but the next predictor was herbivory. So the herbivory has also been in the landscape for a very long time. And I think the point I was trying to make is that there's always been some low level we don't know how much it was, but it was definitely present. So I'm not sure if removing all the herbivory going to be that useful. So unfortunately, how should the forest be in the next 5-10 years? Let me think about this and get back to you. If you can email me, maybe perhaps I'll have more thoughts on this. But I think definitely removal of invasive species and maybe restoring the water resources might definitely help. Sorry.
No, that's perfectly fine. My aim is not to come at the problem from a carbon perspective. If I were to come at it from a biodiversity perspective and say, I want to do as much restoration as possible, and carbon is a byproduct. So it is not carbon with a co-benefit of biodiversity. It is biodiversity with a co-benefit of carbon. Okay, so if I were to
Right.
come at it from a carbon
So in that case,
biodiversity, go ahead, please.
yeah. Yeah, so I think so then it depends on which biome you're in. So in your Western Ghats, if you're on the windward side of the Western Ghats, then it's more of an evergreen rainforest. It'll have very different kinds of things than what you'd expect on the leeward side of the Western Ghats, which is more dry. So yeah, so then it would be I mean, and then so many other factors are going to influence it, right? How close is your patch to the natural forest? Because that will seed the biodiversity in your patch. So many, and also all different biodiversity guilds use different habitats, right? So for example, if you have an edge, right? If you have more disturbance, may have more generalist species. If you have no disturbance, you may have more forest specialist species. So I think it depends on what is the type of biodiversity you want to conserve will determine how you're going to manage it.
See, but my point there is that no matter how I intervene on the land, it'll be my group of specialists' perspective on what should be on the leeward side of the mountain, what should be on the windward side, what is the dynamics of rainfall, this, that, and the other. But it is still a human point of view which determines what is the target state. And I have no way of knowing whether that's the right view or the wrong view. All I know is it's a view. And the problem with this thing is that I could get a counterparty who comes in with a different set of experts and says, well, no, this can be argued another way. And so we're back to the drawing board. So that is why I'm saying instead of getting a room full of experts to decide, what color light bulb we should have, the idea might be to just take the the invasives and to an extent maybe control the grazing. I'm not saying remove grazing because that too is dysfunctional, but in some way to say, how do we establish the natural processes of the land? And given the climate is changing, I don't know what pestilence is going to come in this sample plot. I don't know what other dynamics are going to change. But at the same time, I need to justify to a funder that the right things are being done. And that is the conundrum.
So I think the way to go is that you want to increase the resilience of the system so that no matter how the environment changes, your system still has a good outcome. So I think high diversity is going to help you there. So if you have higher plant diversity, then it's good. Whichever way the system moves, I think you should have some positive outcome.
Right. But I'd like to take you up on the offer to think about it further, though.
Sure. Thank you.
I'll write to you separately. Thank you.
We are right on time. If we don't have any more questions, I request you to conclude the session.
yeah, thank you all for coming for this Coexistence in Practice series. And thank you, Meghna, for a very engaging and interesting talk. And thank you, Coexistence Consortium, for organizing these talks regularly. And we'll be in touch with all of you about the next Coexistence in Practice series talk. And yeah, thank you for coming.
Thank you all. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you to all the people who came and asked questions. Thank you. Thanks.
Recording of this talk will be uploaded on YouTube if anyone wants to go back and look at it. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye, Meghna. Bye.